I'm going to be focusing on subjects in this series that needed dedicated videos, based on noteworthy information that I found in my research. One of these subjects is Exhibitions, Expositions, and World Fairs since 1851. My name is Michelle Gibson. The Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations of 1851 in London was the first in a series of World's Fairs, exhibitions of culture and industry that became popular in the 19th century. What does that 8-pointed star represent in the brochure for it, and the designs on the side? Here are details from the Mabel Tainter Memorial Theater, a theater of Moorish appearance in Menominee, Wisconsin, on the right, compared with the brochure details on the left. Interesting to note that King Kalakaua of Hawaii on the left has 2 8-pointed stars pinned to his jacket in his portrait, and in this portrait of Prince Regent George on the right, his sash is covering a star with at least 3 points. I believe these were symbols and design elements important to the original ancient advanced Moorish civilization. I think there was a hostile takeover of the planet after a deliberately caused cataclysm that resulted in a worldwide flood of mud, which wiped out the original civilization. There was an almost 2-year period of extremely cold, enduring weather in Ireland between 1740 and 1741. The cause is not known, and this information is in the historical record, but is not common knowledge. Hundreds of thousands of people in Ireland died in the cold snap, about 1/5 of the population at the time. To this day, it is the longest period of extreme cold in modern European history, and it led to food riots, famine, epidemics, and death. What if the explanation involves a disruption in the fabric of space-time? What if it took the beings involved in the cataclysm and take over around 100 years to dig the original infrastructure out of the mud flow? What if the timeline we have been taught about in school actually starts in the mid-1800s with a new false historical narrative superimposed onto this infrastructure, one which brought cruelty, great suffering, degradation, and division to humanity? What if the original order of society was turned upside down, and we have been the subjects of a vast human and social engineering project, not for our best interest but that of other beings? What if these exhibitions, expositions, and world fairs, starting in 1851, were showcasing the technology and architectural wonders of the original civilization before being hidden away or forever destroyed? The purpose of the first great exhibition in 1851 was said to be making clear to the world Britain's role as industrial leader, while at the same time it provided a platform on which other countries from around the world could display their achievements. It was organized by Sir Henry Cole, a British civil servant and inventor, and Prince Albert, husband of Queen Victoria. We are told that it took only 9 months to develop it from plans and organization to the grand opening with Queen Victoria. It was also referred to as the Crystal Palace Exhibition, in reference to what was called a temporary structure in which it was held. Let's take a closer look at this so-called temporary structure. Also known as the Great Shalimar, a reference to the Mughal garden complex in Lahore, Pakistan, where you see the 8-pointed star and similar design patterns that I just showed you on the Great Exhibition brochure, in Wisconsin, and on royalty. The Shalimar Gardens are located at the Lahore Fort. The Crystal Palace was said to have been designed by Sir Joseph Paxton, a gardener and greenhouse builder, and built in Hyde Park to house the exhibition. Sir Joseph was said to have been commissioned by Baron Mayer Rothschild in 1850 to design the Mentmore Towers in Buckinghamshire, said to be one of the greatest country houses built during the Victorian era. The Crystal Palace was described as a massive glass house that was 1,848 feet, or 563 meters long, by 454 feet, or 138 meters wide, and constructed from cast iron frame components and glass. There were statues on the inside and trees, said to demonstrate man's triumph over nature. Between May 1st and October 15th of 1851, 6 million people were said to visit the exhibition, including famous people of the time like Charles Darwin, Samuel Colt, Charlotte Bronte, Charles Dickens, and Alfred Lord Tennyson. The proceeds generated by the Great Exhibition of 1851 were then said to be used to found the Victoria and Albert Museum in 1852, which happens to look very similar to the Natural History Museum in Milan, Italy, which was said to have been founded in 1838. Proceeds from the Great Exhibition were also used to found the Science Museum in 1857 and the Natural History Museum in London in 1881. What was the fate of the Crystal Palace itself? Well, we are told the Crystal Palace was moved and re-erected in 1854 to Sydenham Hill in South London and was later destroyed by fire in 1936. How did they manage to move a massive building of plate glass and cast iron, said to be 3 times larger than St. Paul's Cathedral in London? Between 1853 and 1854, the Exhibition of the Industry of All Nations was held in New York in Bryant Park in Manhattan, in the wake of what was considered the highly successful Great Exhibition in London. It aimed to showcase the new industrial achievements of the world and to demonstrate the nationalistic pride of a relatively young nation. The exhibition committee was led by Jacob Westervelt, New York City mayor, considered to be a renowned and prolific shipbuilder, and Admiral Samuel DuPont, a member of the prominent DuPont family, was the general superintendent. Another Crystal Palace was built here for the exhibition. We are told it was constructed in 1853 and designed by German architect Karl Gildemeister and Danish army officer George Carstensen, and said to have been inspired by the Crystal Palace in London. The American poet Walt Whitman penned this poem about it, called The Song of the Exposition. A palace, loftier, fairer, ampler than any yet, earth's modern wonder, history's 7 outstripping, high-rising, tier on tier, with glass and iron facades, gladdening the sun and sky, inhued in the cheerfulest hues, bronze, lilac, robin's egg, marine, and crimson, over whose golden roof shall flaunt, beneath thy banner, freedom. Alas, this beautiful Crystal Palace was also destroyed by fire, but much sooner than what we are told for the one in London. It burned down in 1858, apparently with a large audience, according to this engraving. It looks like the fire brigade is being blocked by all the people watching it burn. Paris hosted the Universal Exposition of the Industry of All the Nations on the Champs-Élysées from May 15th to November 15th in 1855, newly under the reign of Napoleon III. His cousin, Prince Napoleon, was the president of the exposition. Paris attempted to surpass London's Crystal Palace with its own Palais de l'Industrie, said to have been constructed for the industrial component of the exposition in 1855. This Palais de l'Industrie itself was said to have been destroyed in 1897 to make way for the Grand Palais of the 1900 World's Fair in Paris. There was also the Palais du Beaux Arts to house the first fine arts display for a world exposition, pictured here. There was another building which displayed the crown jewels of France and another that held machinery and raw materials. The only building said to still remain standing from the 1855 exposition is the Théâtre du Rond-Point, the location of the National Panorama. And unlike the British, who were said to have had such a surplus of funds that they could fund the opening of 3 museums, the French were said to have lost a great deal of money on the 1855 exposition. The location of the 1876 Centennial Exposition, the first official World's Fair in the United States, was Fairmount Park in Philadelphia. It was held to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The Director General of the exposition, Ohio businessman Alfred Goshern, was said to have been knighted by Queen Victoria because of the success of the Centennial Exposition. Hermann Schwarzmann, a German architect, was given the credit for designing all of the buildings for the Centennial Exposition starting in 1869. This is the Memorial Hall in Fairmount Park, said to have been built as the art gallery for the 1876 Centennial Expo. And the only major structure from that exposition to survive to the present day. It is currently called the Please Touch Museum, which focuses on teaching mostly children 7 years old and younger through interactive exhibits and special events. This was inside the original horticultural hall, no longer standing, that was said to be designed for the 1876 exposition in the Moresque style of the 12th century, and looks a lot on the outside on the top like some Oklahoma high schools to me, like this historic photo of the original Central High School in Tulsa on the bottom. The largest Corliss steam engine ever built, with its 1,400 horsepower engine, was on display in and generated all the energy used in Machinery Hall during the 1876 exposition. The Corliss steam engine was said to have been invented by George Henry Corliss and patented in 1849. It is a steam engine fitted with rotary valves and variable valve timing, and generally 30% more fuel efficient than conventional steam engines. This is the front view of the steam engine at the exposition. The side view, and the top view. Now for comparison, check out what is found at what is called an old sugar mill in Belize in Central America. From the looks of this tree growth, very old. The Southern Exposition was a 5-year series of world fairs held in Louisville, Kentucky between 1883 and 1887 in what is now called the Old Louisville neighborhood. The exposition was held for 100 days each of those years in a location immediately south of Louisville's Central Park, which was originally a country estate of the DuPont family, on what was called heavily forested hunting grounds. We are told the main exposition building was meant to be a temporary space. When 1 million visitors came to the expo in its first year in 1883, the Southern Exposition was expanded to run between August and November until 1887. This was the scene at the opening ceremonies where President Chester A. Arthur spoke in 1883. The Southern Exposition was the largest installation of incandescent light bulbs since their invention, we are told, by Thomas A. Edison between 1878 and 1880, allowing for nighttime visitation. In 1890, the Southern Exposition site was turned into the St. James and Belgravia courts, now a historic housing district, and an auditorium was said to have been built with the materials salvaged from the main exposition building. The auditorium was said to be part of a large entertainment complex that included a bike riding park, man-made lagoon, promenade, and a 10,000-seat outdoor amphitheater. The amphitheater auditorium was said to have been razed to the ground in 1905, only 16 years after its completion. The 1884 World's Fair was held in New Orleans and was called the World's Industrial and Cotton Centennial Exposition. The main building enclosed 33 acres, or 13 hectares, and was said to be the largest roofed structure constructed up to that time. This was the horticultural hall of the 1884 exposition and the octagonal building of the Mexico exhibit. The octagonal building of the Mexican exhibit is said to be the Moorish kiosk, which is found in Mexico City. The person who gets the credit for it was a Mexican engineer named Jose Ramon Ibarroa. He is said to have designed it to represent Mexico for the New Orleans Centennial Expo. We are also told that this structure was at the St. Louis, Missouri Fair in 1904 as well. Does this look like a portable structure to you? And there are design patterns of 8 pointed stars in the Moorish kiosk, and what I will call figure eights for this example. It is the same idea as what I shared with you earlier in this video. The location of the 1884 New Orleans Exposition is now Audubon Park, This is said to be a chunk of iron ore from the Alabama exhibit on the Audubon golf course at the park. And the Audubon Zoo. In 1888, Cincinnati, Ohio was the location of the Centennial Exposition of the Ohio Valley and Central States, also known as the World's Fair of Cincinnati, and the 100th anniversary of Cincinnati's founding. The Machinery Hall was situated across the Miami and Erie canals and was said to have been transformed into a Venetian delight, with imported gondolas and gondoliers from Venice, and daily races and rides. What if the gondolas and gondoliers weren't actually imported from Venice, but instead were already here? This is outside of the Machinery Hall on the left and has the look of a staged photo, very much like this one in Trenton, New Jersey, on the right. The Music Hall was said to have been built in 1877 at the cost of $1 million for use in some previous industrial expositions in Cincinnati, as well as for being a choral facility. This was a bridge associated with the Music Hall. Where is everybody? The main building was in Washington Park. Washington Park Hall boasted of one of the largest fountains constructed in the country, 89 feet or 27 meters long, and 68 feet or 21 meters wide, with a jet that rose 65 feet or 20 meters in the air. Nicknamed the Fairy Fountain, when the gallery played Strauss waltzes, the fountain illuminated in time with the music. There are many more examples along the same lines to which I will give you just a simple introduction. The Colonial and Indian Exhibition in London in 1886, the Piedmont Exposition in Atlanta in 1887, the Melbourne Centennial Exhibition in 1888, the Universal Exposition in Paris in 1889, the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago in 1893, the California Midwinter Exposition of 1894 in San Francisco, the Central American Exposition in Guatemala City, Guatemala in 1897, the International Exposition in Hobart, Tasmania in 1894 and 1895, the Cotton States and International Exposition in Atlanta in 1895, the Tennessee Centennial and International Exposition in Nashville in 1897, the Trans-Mississippi and International Exposition in Omaha, Nebraska in 1898, the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York in 1901, the Glasgow International Exposition in 1901, the South Carolina Interstate and West Indian Exposition in Charleston in 1901 and 1902, the Wolverhampton Exhibition in 1902 in Wolverhampton, England, the Hanoi Exhibition in Vietnam in 1902 and 1903, the Louisiana Purchase Exhibition in St. Louis, Missouri in 1904, the Lewis and Clark Exhibition in Portland, Oregon in 1905, the Jamestown Exposition in Norfolk, Virginia in 1907, the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition in Seattle in 1909, the Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco in 1915, the Panama California Exposition in San Diego in 1915 and 1916, the Sesquicentennial International Exposition in Philadelphia in 1926, the Chicago World's Fair in 1933 and 1934, the California Pacific International Exposition in San Diego in 1935 and 1936, the Great Lakes Exposition in Cleveland in 1936 and 1937, the Texas Centennial International Exposition in Dallas in 1936 and 1937, the Golden Gate International Exposition in San Francisco in 1939 and 1940, and the New York World's Fair in 1939 and 1940. There were other world fairs and expositions held around the world after this, but I want to focus on the earlier ones for the purposes of this video and the point I want to make. Does any of this sound feasible or even plausible? I think it makes much more sense to view it from the perspective that humanity was on a much more advanced timeline than we have been taught. Most of the beautiful legacy of the human race has been destroyed, and we have been kept in the dark about it. What wasn't destroyed were turned into government buildings like the Baltimore City Hall, schools like El Paso High School, and museums like the Museum of Art in Central Park, and the list of repurposed buildings goes on and on. We don't question how this monumental architecture could have possibly come into existence in the historical narrative we have been given. In the next video, I will be focusing on monuments and memorials.